Welcome to the 10th episode of the Sydney Contrarian, titled How the Debt-Driven Property Bubble Can Burst. I will try to provide a concise explanation as to why I believe the property market, especially that of Sydney and Melbourne, are setting up for a future crash, the data and commentary you might ought to know from the RBA and the media that is hidden in plain sight, and the process in which prices crash. Because of years of investor complacency, when prices reverse, it will be violent. As the saying goes, prices go up the stairs and down the elevator. In our climate, however, it will actually jump out the window. Firstly, I'll talk about some smoking guns from the Reserve Bank of Australia and Domain that suggest all may not be well with the rise of the property markets in both Sydney and Melbourne. Next, I'll explore the data that the RBA and media outlets have used to peddle the narrative of how property prices can only rise or at most plateau, and I'll provide you with my interpretations as to why the narrative is not supported by the data that they provide. Finally, I'll explore a model that may reflect herd mentality in the way markets rise and how they fall. In this video, I've explored two articles, but I'll not be going through them in detail in this video since it will take too long. Instead, I'll provide key takeaways to make my case. So I advise you to read the articles yourself, and I have provided the link in the description. One of the leading sources of property investing in Australia is Domain, and they have been known to publish many articles in recent times touting how the Sydney and Melbourne property markets are strong, and at worst it can only plateau. However, I was surprised that on the 1st of May this year, they had a feature article titled "The Ways an Australian Housing Bubble Could Burst." This article explores what the experts believe to be 4 possible key scenarios of which the housing bubble could burst. Interesting is that this article provides a relatively matter-of-fact outline of each scenario and how they could play out, without providing even an inkling of this is not going to happen or there'll be a soft landing, which is what many so-called experts have tried to place as a caveat in their analysis in many other articles, and also when you see the pundits from regulation authorities and banks, they always seem to say, oh, these things are not going to happen or it's going to be a soft landing. But this one, they avoided that. So the 4 scenarios that the experts predominantly believe could cause the housing bubble to pop are tightening lending, interest rate hikes, and mortgage stress. The second one being underemployment and unemployment causing slow deflation. The third one is government intervention failure and market repair. And finally, a global crisis. What I find interesting is that these experts see these as 4 possible scenarios rather than these 4 scenarios potentially happening simultaneously or sequentially. If you recall from my earlier episodes, I place a housing bubble's rise and future imminent bursting on complacency over low interest rates. Basically, it is that simple. Interest rates have fallen very low and prices have gone up, and the tide is about to turn. However, let me go deeper into the article's narrative and pick out some common themes from each of the 4 scenarios explored, because they yield very interesting results. The writers explore each of the 4 scenarios by explaining step by step how in each case the prices of properties could fall sharply in the end. However, what I identify is a common theme of the causes of property prices falling is a rise of interest rates. The catalysts for the interest rate rises are either due to banks facing increasing costs in raising their funds, government policy failure leading to a weakening economy, so the threat of deflation leads to the Reserve Bank of Australia needing to raise interest rates to spur inflation, and the Federal Reserve leading the way in raising interest rates, with other central banks following suit. Put simply, it is the interest rate, stupid. So looking at the chart of the historical interest rates as set by the Reserve Bank of Australia, and also include the average mortgage rates offered by our banks on owner-occupiers, and the margin that the banks are earning on these mortgages above the RBA interest rates, you can see that the margin banks are earning have been increasing in the past 9 years. This actually coincides with the subprime crisis beginning. So, since the subprime crisis, banks have actually been helping themselves on mortgage borrowers by cutting interest rates on mortgage loans less than the RBA has cut rates for the Australian economy, and thereby they are the ones earning more profits at the back of lower interest rates. Now, while Australian borrowers have enjoyed lower interest rates on their mortgages over the past 6 years, they have at the same time borrowed substantially more. And in the recent 6 months, banks have begun to move ahead of the RBA by raising interest rates on their mortgages, citing the higher cost of raising funds from overseas cut into their profit margin. And as a result, this will place more pressure on borrowers in being able to consume and save outside of purchasing and paying off their properties. Now, the RBA Governor Philip Lowe gave a speech on the 4th of May titled Household Debt, Housing Prices and Resilience. And in this speech, he actually made a comment, with less appetite to incur more debt for current consumption, this part of the monetary transmission mechanism looks to be weaker than it once was. When the interest rate cycle turns and rates begin to rise, the higher debt levels are likely to make spending more responsive to interest rates than was the case in the past. So they are signaling possible interest rate increases, and they also expect that the Australian public will be much more responsive. What they actually mean by being more responsive is, as prices came as the interest rates went down and property prices went up, it went up in a gradual manner. But as interest rates start to rise, you can expect that those prices are going to fall much more sharply because of the burden of household debt. The article also discusses how the level of household debt can end up causing the property bubble bursting, as many borrowers are already straining under their mortgage in the current climate. The prices, especially in Sydney and Melbourne properties, are so high that young buyers are unable to enter as it is out of their reach. Now, this might not be a problem, but with the current property market bubble, it is a problem because prices need to keep rising to help the existing borrowers to repay their debt by having new cash being injected into the bubble. You've got to actually have people buying these properties and letting them go up so that those who went in the bubble earlier on are able to make a profit. Without the funds flowing in, the bubble is going to deflate rapidly because you've got people who are actually hoping to sell to a rising market. And when the bubble begins to deflate, whereby there's more sellers than there are buyers, what's going to happen is that the most vulnerable buyers will have to throw in the towel since they cannot cover their interest payments. And the first tier of distressed sellers that go will expose the next tier of distressed sellers as prices come down, and this could well cascade. Let us look at some hard economic data to further explain what is really happening with the underlying mechanics beneath the housing bubble. I provided some charts from our personal analysis and also from the speech that the RBA Governor Philip Lowe presented in his speech, and you can find the link to the speech provided in the description. Looking at the housing bubble in the context of income growth and housing price growth in Sydney, we can see that it is alarming. Housing prices are almost 9 times that 30 years ago, while income is less than 4 times. The yawning gap between the housing prices and income is bridged by a combination of foreign investor cash and mortgage loans. And what is more concerning is that income growth in the past 5 years have averaged 3% per annum, compared to the housing prices growing at over 10% per annum. So either income has to grow much faster, or housing prices have to slow down. It cannot go along in its merry way that much longer. Well, you can take a guess at which one is more likely to happen if I'm to tell you that Australian businesses have experienced significant slowdown across almost all sectors in the recent few years. Now, Governor Lowe's comments regarding the trend in income and housing price growth is as follows. My judgment, though, is that in the current environment, the resilience of our economy would be enhanced by an extended period in which housing prices and debt outstanding increase no faster than our incomes. In the current environment of low income growth, faster growth in household debt is unlikely to help that resilience. Well, the resilience he speaks of is a fantasy, since we have a false dichotomy here. Increase income faster when businesses are actually weak and closing down, or don't borrow too much to buy a property, and thereby you are threatening the resilience of the economy as we speak. The charts here show the increase in housing prices and household debt relative to income in the past 25 years. They actually confirm that even though income has been growing, the amount borrowed by Australian property buyers have grown even more. The housing prices have grown on the back of greater debt, and it is almost moving in tandem with each other. The narrative that our economy is strong and it supports rising housing prices is a complete scam, because people are borrowing more to keep this charade going on. Of course, you could say, well, there are a lot of foreign buyers coming in and pushing housing prices up, but that just actually helps my narrative in saying that the locals are not having to borrow even more to get to buy a property, because the foreign buyers who are paying cash are jacking prices up. And in terms of the breakdown of how much Australian households owe, it is enough to make your eyes water. Almost 40% of Australian households owe more than 1 year of their income, or around $80,000. And just under 10% of Australian households owe more than 5 years of their income, which is around $400,000. This proportion has been rising even as interest rates are falling, suggesting that as interest rates rise, the proportion of Australian households that are struggling under rising debt is going to balloon, because as interest rates rise, households have to pay more interest, or if they cannot, then they face an even slower reduction of their principal, or they might actually end up being even more underwater. Now, Governor Lowe comments that in terms of resilience, my overall assessment is that the recent increase in household debt relative to our incomes has made the economy less resilient to future shocks. Now, did you hear that loud and clear? Relative to our incomes has made the economy less resilient to future shocks. Less resilient. Where's that soft landing that people are trying to imagine is going to happen? It won't. Now, Australians do not hear much commentary about how the property bubble is in greater danger of bursting, as they have been bombarded on TV, newspapers and in the streets about how our property markets are not showing any signs of a slowdown. One key metric that is being peddled around to support this narrative is the auction clearance rate, which is supposed to theoretically measure how many properties are being put on auction, how many properties put on auction are sold on a weekly basis. The auction clearance rates, especially in Sydney and Melbourne, have hovered between 75 to 90% in the past 2 years. And this is what the pundits will keep telling you on the back of this measure. Buy now, because these properties are going out the door. Now, auhouseprices.com offers some breakdown of the numbers that are published alongside the auction clearance rates. However, looking at it closely, these numbers make very little intuitive sense, and the site offers no clear explanation on how the auction clearance rates are calculated. In fact, it took me months to realize how they even got the number. It took me less than 5 minutes, though, to work out that the rate is not correctly calculated. So using an example, on Saturday the 27th of May 2017, Sydney reported an auction clearance rate of 76% on the back of 836 listed properties, 548 reported auctions, and 453 sales. If you divide the sales by listed, you will get 54%. The reported divided by listed, you'll get 66%, both of which are smaller than the 76% reported. But if you scroll down the bottom of the page, you will find that they report the clearance rates for houses and apartments. The clearance rates for houses is 71% and 80% for apartments. Now average them out and you'll get 76%. That is really, really pushing it. However, If you actually add the number of houses and apartments sold or reported, you get 639 sales of 876 reported. Neither of these numbers agree with what is reported alongside the auction clearance rates. So this is gibberish statistics. Now, the way that the mainstream media presents the narratives using rosy data to support it should be understood further. Optimistic reports on the property markets using underlying data that is not calculated correctly actually show you a wrong narrative. And when you use the correct calculations based on their numbers, you get a much bleaker picture. Now, I don't blame the journalists, since they're not really mathematicians and they're not experts in this area. But the economists and the real estate industry experts are not stupid. They know the data presented, but they insist on weaving their narratives on false and incorrect data in order to serve their own interests. This is an indictment on the real state of the real estate market, pun intended. So finally, I want to provide you with a simple explanation of how a bubble grows and how fast it can burst using an illustration of a pyramid. Now, prices are set at the margin, in that the price of any asset is set by the most recent trade. The buyer is willing to pay the price to get the asset, and the seller is willing to sell at that price because they believe that a higher price is not going to be offered at that instant in time and they do not want to wait. So in building a bubble, as in more buyers are willing to buy than sellers are willing to sell, the prices are going to be symbolized at the tip of the pyramid. And capital flows from the base of the pyramid to push it up. So it takes more capital as prices go up because the price goes up from the capital building from the base and moving upwards. However, when more sellers are in the market than buyers, then it actually works the other way around. The sellers take the price according to what the market is willing to pay, and the capital flows out of the base of the pyramid. Now, the capital weighs down from the top of the pyramid, signifying the amount that asset holders had used to finance their purchases. Now, if most of this capital is owned by the asset holder, then there is less pressure as the selling speeds up because the owners can sit on their losses and wait for a recovery. They're not desperate to sell. But if they borrow to buy these assets, they have less buffer because even a modest drop in the price cuts into their equity or what they actually own. So if an investor is highly leveraged or they owe a lot, then it takes only a small percentage in the drop of the prices before they lose everything and they have to sell because they have nothing, and the owners are the creditors, the people who they borrowed from, virtually own the property or the asset. And with such high gearing levels as we have today in Australian property, we are basically working on an inverted pyramid with a thin tip and a huge base pressing down upon it. So as distressed property owners sell when interest rate rises, the tip of the pyramid gets taken out and the pyramid is going to crumble by the virtual weight of the leverage or the loans. Now, as for the property markets in Sydney and Melbourne, you have been given a muted warning from the RBA and also in the domain. You have no excuse now to say that you are not aware. You just merely can say you don't believe in it. And the experts will have no excuse to say that they did not see it coming because they are actually spoken up about it. Whether you choose to believe and be prepared is another question. But listeners on my channel hopefully can say that they have heard it loud and clear and they understand the logic behind it. Well, that's it from the Sydney Contrarian. Stay tuned for a future episode. Once again, God bless.